This is January 30, 2007. We're doing another oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Today our interviewee is William Snoddy, who is an old-timer in the space program. Bill, it's good to have you here today.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be here.
We like to start out by giving you a chance to tell a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up and went to school, and how you got into the space program. So, have at it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a native North Alabamian, and which was kind of rare a little bit in those early days here in Huntsville. Grew up born in Russellville, grew up in Haleyville, graduated from school over there. In the early 50s, I began to become aware of Huntsville. Decatur was really the big town in North Alabama. We'd come over here sometime when we wanted to go to the big town. We'd come to Decatur, and then things started happening in Huntsville, and they had their 150th anniversary in about mid-50s, and the Birmingham paper, which is the one we all took, it seemed every week had some article about the exciting things happening in Huntsville and in connection with their heritage and then the new things that were happening. And I thought, gee, that is a neat place. Never dreaming that I'd end up spending my career here. Went off to the University of Alabama after I graduated from high school. And didn't know what I wanted to do. My dad was a doctor. He thought dentistry would be a great thing. Suggested I do pre-dentistry. I did. Wasn't really that interested. Probably would have been a horrible dentist. I did major in physics, though, which I did enjoy, and which dental school said would be a good major for that sort of thing, to my surprise. And when I was a senior, an amazing thing happened. The Russians launched something called Sputnik, and that really shook up the world, I guess, and we physics majors were especially enthralled with it because we understood sort of what it meant. I can remember my roommate at the time, he and I going out to the cemetery there on the campus, or near the campus at Tuscaloosa, one cold October night, I guess it was, because we'd read in the paper where Sputnik would go over and you could see it. And we went out to see for ourselves and nothing happened. But then, 10 or 15 minutes late, here it came. And just couldn't believe it. Very emotional moment. And especially when as a physics major, I realized that thing was going 18,000 miles an hour or thereabouts. An unheard of speed. Just couldn't conceive of anything man-made going that fast. I used to, say, gee, if it was a car on the road, then 1 second it'd be 2.5 miles over here, and the next second it'd be 2.5 miles over there, 5 miles a second or so. And how can that possibly be? But it was, and we'd seen it with our own eyes. And I graduated. I'd been accepted for graduate school. I knew I had to get more than a BS in physics, and I decided that really seemed like a lot more my cup of tea than dentistry was. And I was offered a summer job in Huntsville. Came here and for the summer.
What summer was that?
That was the summer of '58. Couldn't find a place to live. My dad suggested we check out Monticello State Park. We did, and to our amazement, we were offered the use of the lodge up there, they called it. I'm not sure if that was the proper name. It was a great big building with bunk beds in it. 6 of us, I believe, stayed there, including Bob Nauman, I think you've already talked with.
He mentioned it.
Okay, and we spent the summer there. At the end of the summer, various folks in that group went different directions. I ended up being offered a summer job, and a permanent job, and decided to stick around at least for a while, and never left. So, been here ever since, and had a wonderful career at NASA.
What did you start working on when you were, I guess that would have still been the Army in those days?
It was ABMA, Army Ballistic Missile Agency. I went to work in Ernst Stuhlinger's office, Research Projects Office, and they had no space for us there, so Bob and I were both in that office. We had desks in the hallway. I was sitting right outside of Herman Oberst's office, who was von Braun's mentor and was spending a few years here kind of as von Braun's guest, I suppose. And we young folks couldn't believe that this guy was just right there and that we could go in and see some of the wondrous things he was still conjuring up on his drawing board, including one giant pogo stick with a habitat on top that might be used to traverse the moon and things of that sort. Really amazing things. So, and I was assigned to Gerhard Heller in that office and to look at the thermal design of satellites. They had just launched Explorer 1. Explorer 2 did not go in orbit. Explorer 3 did, and both of those satellites did not have the temperature that they thought they should have. They were 30 degrees or so colder than it was expected. And so Heller asked me, maybe tongue-in-cheek, I don't know, but to go in there and independently calculate what those temperatures should be to see what results I came up with from scratch. No help, really. And so I did finally manage to do things and essentially agreed with his results, the results we calculated earlier, except in one regard. And the Explorers were long, as you know, Chuck. He was there. He was one of the branch chiefs. They were orbited, spun up, and went in orbit, spinning. It was assumed that the sun would shine like that on them, and that would cause a certain temperature. I noticed that if you assume that this spin thing turned over and wobbled around and ended up going like a propeller, then the temperature would drop about 30 degrees, which might explain it. And in fact, you could see the temperature dropping over a period of several weeks. And so I postulated that maybe the darn thing went from here to here, and it turned out, in fact, that's what had happened, that momentum was conserved. Keep me straight on this, Chuck, but the energy had to be dissipated. It wasn't expected that energy would dissipate, therefore it couldn't do this, but it had done it. And they realized the thing creaked and groaned enough to where it could dissipate energy, and that explained what finally happened. And so that was kind of a neat thing to get involved with and that early in one's career, you know.
That same conclusion was also possible to reach from the antenna pattern and the strength of the radio signals coming from the satellite.
And Van Allen came to the same conclusion based on he had a radiation detector on there discovered the Van Allen belts, Explorer 1 and that series. And I remember once he and I discussed it in my office when we were looking at thermal things, and I told how I'd come up with this. And he says, "Oh, but we did it first." I said, "No, we did it first. We had fun. Never really resolved it, but that was a neat time, exciting time for us guys."
Mm-hmm. And it was an exciting time for the world, really.
It was that. Another thing, which Bob Allen alluded to, is the Explorer 4 was being ready to be launched. 1 week after I came on board, Gerhard Heller went on his vacation and sent me over to be in charge of the thermal design of the thermal test experiments on Explorer 4. And I'd been on the job less than a month, and July the 4th weekend he was gone. I'd been there less than a month, and was suddenly in charge of an experiment to make sure that the satellite was ready to be launched. And that was pretty heady stuff for a guy just out of college, as you can well imagine. And so no wonder I decided to stick around after the summer was up when given the opportunity. And instead of going to graduate school at Alabama, they said, "You can stay here and we'll send you to graduate school here at the extension that they had at the time." That was before UEH was here. It was an extension of the University of Alabama, and they had classes over in particular, I went to some over in the Quonset hut where the mulch pile is near the Botanical Garden now. And one advantage of going to classes up here was we didn't have much in the way of facilities or anything, but we had a wonderful cadre of folks who'd come in from all over the nation who could be on the side, could do some of the instruction. And so we had outstanding instructors, one of whom was my first graduate school instructor, is this guy right here. And so that worked out well as also. I could stay here, do the fun stuff, and still work on advanced degrees.
Well, what came next in the chain of events on the space program in your career?
Well, I guess after I got involved in the thermal design of a lot of the early satellites, that was fun. Got to go down to the Cape, be involved in the launch process, partly because we want to make real sure that the surfaces and the color of those surfaces were not changed any prior to launch. And so I got to be there and be a part of the launch of quite a few of those Explorers 4, 6, 7, 8, 11, quite a few of them. And that was exciting. And then all of a sudden, President Kennedy decided, let's go to the moon. And we just launched Gus Grissom on Alan Shepard on about a 500-mile lob, and that was it. And all of a sudden, we were going to go to the moon and come back safely.
By that time, of course, the Marshall Center had been created, and the Army was off doing other things.
That's correct. In 1958, I remember I was on a business trip, and I went away as an employee of the Army, and I came back as an employee.
1960, I think.
60, you're correct. And I came back, 1958 is when NASA was created.
Yeah.
1960, we became part of it. I went away July 1st. That was the start of the fiscal year at that time. Went away as an Army employee, came back as a NASA employee. Same job, same people, but different badge. The neat thing was that all the stuff that had been classified up to then was no longer classified. And so you could talk about it to friends and family when before we really couldn't say that much. Well, and then Apollo came along.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what did you do with Apollo?
Well, thermal-related issues with the Apollo as well. The surface of the moon was a different thermal environment than we'd been working with before, which was orbital environment. And so we realized we needed to know what that thermal environment of the moon was if we were going to put objects there, including people. And so we decided, well, not enough data to our liking, we'll just gather our own data. So working with Jim Fountain and others, Walt Fountain, infrared telescopes were set up right there at Marshall, and we looked at the moon, recorded you could see the infrared heat, which is a function of temperature from various points on the surface of the moon, and we can monitor those throughout a lunar day-night period, which is a moon cycle. The moon's day is 1 month long, so to speak, 15 days of sunshine, 15 days of darkness. We can monitor how these surfaces temperature behaved, and then we compare that with when the moon went into the Earth's shadow during an eclipse, when suddenly the sunlight was turned off and the temperature would drop rapidly. And then when it would come back out, it would rise rapidly. And the rate at which it dropped and rose and the shape of that drop, and compared with the longer changes, begin to give us some idea of what must the structure of the moon be in order for it to have these kind of lunar characteristics. We decided to further test that by seeing if we could simulate it in our lab. And so we'd already developed some laboratory facilities, the first that research projects had, and that's when the basis of those labs and others, it became Space Sciences Lab, not just an office. But and we were testing thermal control surfaces and seeing how well they might hold up in the environment of space by simulating space environment. And we digress in a minute. We developed little sensors that flew on some of the early satellites to see how well in orbit these surfaces held up, and in particular whether or not meteoroids might erode the coatings that we put on away in short order. Initially, we weren't sure of that at all. It turns out that really wasn't that much of a concern. Ultraviolet radiation was the bigger thing. It would cause white paint to yellow quickly, for example. But anyway, we had these laboratory facilities, so we decided to try to simulate this lunar environment. We put in materials that were thought to be the sort of thing the moon was made of. We ground them up and had them solid, and we had the layers, and we did these simulation lunar conditions and looked at their temperature changes and compared them with what we saw. And when we finally got a match, we says, maybe this is what the moon is made of and how it works. And that was before surveyor had landed on the moon. Turns out we were right, and that was very satisfying. So that we did that. Our surfaces were used, the coatings that we helped develop were used on the Apollo program. We found out we had done some work on some paraffins, which melts at specific temperatures. If you got a glass of ice water, and if there's water and there's ice both, then it's 32 degrees. You get it good mixed up. As long as there's ice in it, as long as there's water, it's 32. If it solidly freezes, then it can start to go below 32. If it's all becomes liquid, then it can start going up. But as long as you got both, you can pretty much count on it being 32. Certain paraffins do the same thing, we discovered. There's a whole family of them. So by picking a paraffin at a certain temperature, you could control something within a certain range very accurately. And in fact, that was used by our friends in Houston, that some of our paraffins on the lunar lander, to help stabilize some temperatures while they were on the lunar surface. So we felt good about that as well, of course. And then finally, I guess, on the Apollo program, towards the end of the program especially, the astronauts complained about the 3 days they spent going and the 3 days they spent coming, and there's nothing to do. Could we please come up with some things for them to do? So the Space Sciences Laboratory immediately went into high gear, coming up with all kinds of little experiments that had to be small and so on, that they then carried with them. And we came up with one that had to do with convection. On Earth, gravity causes hot things to rise, cold things to settle, but in orbit there is no gravity, so you wouldn't expect to be any. But there was some speculation that there would still be some in some situations due to surface tension. And so we designed an experiment using liquid crystals, which were a unique thing that had just been invented. And now that's what they're everywhere. All these, television sets and everything use liquid crystal technology. But we got our hands on some, designed an experiment, and with a liquid in it, had liquid crystals on the surface, a little hot pan on the bottom. The astronaut turned on the pan, got it hot, and sure enough, even though there was no convection there, after a while these little pattern of convection showed up. Barnard cells were the theoretical. And that was kind of exciting, and that kind of laid some of the groundwork for what later came in the commercial use of space, we'll probably get to later. So that was kind of my involvement in the Apollo program, I guess. Thermally related things.
And Apollo was followed on, of course, by Skylab.
Yes, and that was more of interest, I guess, to us in the Space Sciences Lab, because that really got into an awful lot of science and a whole range of it, from looking down at the Earth to looking at the stars, and looking at the sun, and so on. And so there were lots of opportunity for the Space Science Lab to get involved. At that time, my division that I was head of was interested in solar physics as well as lunar physics and so on. Solar astronomy was one of the primary things on Skylab, and we developed one of the SO56, sort of a soft X-ray experiment that flew on Skylab, and then later I was involved in the managing the analysis of all the data from all the experimenters. But before that happened, there were 3 Skylab missions where humans went up and occupied this small, well, not that small, rather large space station actually. And on the last mission, just before the mission was underway to go up there, someone discovered a comet. A guy named Kohoutek was the discoverer, and so it was named Comet Kohoutek. It was one that was thought never before had come in to visit the sun. Apparently there's maybe billions of comets way out beyond Pluto, in a kind of a cloud out there, and occasionally one loses its angular velocity and falls into the sun, and we think that was the case with Kohoutek. And it was discovered when it was extremely far away from the sun yet, and they don't give off light of their own, they only give off reflected light. So the fact that it was seen so far away, then it had to be pretty darn big, which, and based on its orbit, looked like there's a chance it could be really spectacular. So our friends up at the Smithsonian, who were in charge of these kinds of things, and Chuck used to be head of that, so a group up there put out some press announcements about what could possibly be the comet of the century and got everybody all excited about it, and it was decided that, by golly, Skylab ought to take advantage of that. We need somebody to go down to Houston, sit in mission control, and lead the Skylab effort for gathering data on Comet Kohoutek, the integrated effort using all the various instruments, no matter what they were. And I got picked. I think he may have had something to do with it. But anyway, I was given a crash course in comets, and here I went down for about 4 months to lead the effort on what can we do on Skylab to gather data on Comet Kohoutek. And we did a great job. And there were a lot of people that were intrigued by it, that were more than willing to spend part of their precious observing time to gather data. Unfortunately, it never amounted to anything in terms of being spectacular here on Earth, so it was sort of a failure. It was a public failure, but a scientific success. It was by far the most observed comet ever. And we gathered so much data on the Skylab part of it that we had our very own workshop with many scientists from around the country coming here to compare data on what we had done on Comet Kohoutek. So that was an interesting time, to say the least. That's when I learned about the media and how you have to be careful what you say to them, because some of them are looking to sensationalize things, and I learned on-the-job training about dealing with the media.
Well, at the end of Skylab, you were also involved, I think, in helping the solar physicists work together to do a whole series of monographs on the sun.
That's right. There was a tremendous amount of data gathered by some extremely competent groups. There were 5 groups in all that had satellites, had telescopes, and so NASA had budgeted about $25 million, which was a lot of money in that time, for data analysis, and I was put in charge of making sure the taxpayers got their money's worth. And as I've said, that was probably the easiest job I ever had in my life, because I've never worked with a group of people more motivated to produce something from this data than this group was. In many cases, it was their entire professional career in developing and flying these instruments, and so they didn't need me motivating them. It was the other way around. It was trying to just staying within budget. They had more ideas than we had budget to cover. And we'd have workshops and symposiums on various topics, and out of those symposiums would come these monographs or books, and really they just did a marvelous job. I was just fortunate enough to be the guy that, sort of the manager, but I didn't really have to manage. I just had to just say, go for it, guys, and that was a great experience for me, and it was a fun time.
By the time that was over, the set of monographs on the sun from Skylab and the related ground observation during Skylab were the reference on the nature of the sun. That was the best information on the sun available anywhere in the world at the time.
And we made real sure, another thing was that all the data was, most of the data was taken on film. It was actually used in space. That was before the day of all the digital stuff we have now. And so we had all this wonderful film, all these wonderful images, and we had them in hand, and we wanted to make sure. So part of this analysis was to make sure that was properly archived. And to this day, it's in a dark area, it's refrigerated, and it's kept away from oxygen. And so if there's a real need to go and get that film back out because some new theory, then it can be done. But that was part of trying to finish the job up properly. And so that was a great experience. It really was.
Well, about that time when Skylab ended, I think you got involved in some still different programs.
Well, I was minding my own business, so to speak, and at NASA headquarters, they have the Office of Space Sciences, and they have the different divisions. One of them was the Solar Terrestrial Division, and I was at the Space Sciences lab. I was head of the Solar Terrestrial Division, and that was fine. In headquarters, each of these divisions had a person who was the advanced planner in charge of pulling together all the future programs in those areas. And the person who had been in charge of that for that division was promoted on up. That was Adrian Timothy, to a more senior job, and I was offered the job to come up and take her job as advanced planner in NASA headquarters. Didn't really want to move. I was an Alabamian, wanted to stay in Alabama, and so we compromised and said, well, if you'll come up for 1 year, it'd be good experience for you, and that'll give us plenty of time to get the right person in the job. So we packed up, we moved up, and spent a wonderful year in Washington, helping out in this area that I was already quite familiar with. And it was a great experience. It turned out to be a bigger experience than I had expected, though, because at the end of the Apollo program, NASA was at a crossroads in terms of what it would do next. It wanted to, under Von Braun's leadership as a NASA advanced planner, to go ahead and let's start thinking about going to Mars, with a space station maybe being the first step, and then on to Mars. But the country wasn't ready to do that. The Nixon administration wasn't ready to do that. And we were told, nope, that's too ambitious. You've got to do something else. And so the something else turned out to be the shuttle. Let's do the shuttle now, and then later we'll build a space station maybe that it can go to. But in the meanwhile, let's just do the shuttle, and it would be a very cost-effective way of going to and from space, carrying satellites up, retrieving satellites, and doing whatever you need to do in space. We needed a really good way of doing it, and the shuttle was the thing that they decided to build. And let's don't talk about space station now, and let's sure don't talk about going back to the moon or to Mars now. That's verboten. And so we were not allowed to discuss space station, even though someday we hoped to build one. The Office of Space Sciences, while I was up there, decided, well, we need to do something more than what we're doing, and we need to do something that involves this new shuttle and that involves astronauts, because they are a big part of NASA's program. And as one of the astronauts himself said, if there's no Buck Rogers, there's probably no Bucks. So that sort of made sense too. And so the Office of Space Sciences said, let's see if we can take the lead in deciding how to use this shuttle in a way that we really like, and that would use the astronauts in a way that we would like to use them. And so they came up with the concept of platforms, they call them. We had already invented something called Space Lab. It was sort of a module in the back of the shuttle that's remained with the shuttle, in which you could do all kinds of laboratory experiments for a limited period of time, 10 days maybe max. And so sort of the idea was maybe we can just unload this capability and leave it up there in space with a power module attached to it, and then visit it every 3 months or so and exchange experiments. And maybe in some cases we can actually leave something out there with people in it, but we won't call it a space station. You know, it'll be a laboratory of some sort. And so we work, and I was, as an advanced planner, I got caught up in this process there at NASA headquarters. And we had platforms for astronomy, platforms for Earth observation, platforms for polar observation, platforms for human research, and each division was, supporting this. And I ended up being the manager and having to present it to the administrator and others. And so we came up with this Science and Application Space Platform Program, a multi-billion-dollar program that would involve 5 or 6 of these platforms, different orbits, different purposes, each in the orbit that best suited its purpose. And we thought it made a lot of sense. And furthermore, we were able to get the Academy of Sciences support on a lot of what we were doing. The National Academy of Sciences, who's set up to advise the government on the credibility of scientific matters, have committees in all these areas. And so we would go to these committees and try to convince them that this is really something you guys can use in solar physics as one of these solar platforms, or you in astronomy can use this astronomy platform. And they begin to say, that is rather intriguing. So we had a lot of support building from the National Academy of Science committees towards this whole concept of space platforms. At the end of the 1 year, I came back to Huntsville, and Huntsville Marshall was given the lead to flesh this out even more, and I was made the manager of that. At the same time, our friends down in Houston says, well, we don't know about that. We think we need a space operations center, a big station where we can learn how to operate in space, and which probably would be the first step towards going to Mars. So they have what they call SOC, S-O-C, Space Operations Center, and we had at Marshall this SAS, Science and Applications Space Platform concept, and they were competing. And our sponsorship was the Office of Space Sciences. SOC's sponsorship was the manned offices in NASA headquarters. And but meanwhile, the administration in Washington wasn't interested in either one of them. So it was all academic, you know, up until that point, and was kind of languishing, and we were each kind of developing these concepts more fully and more fully and more fully. But it wasn't really going all that far in terms of serious bucks being spent on it. And so things began to get sort of routine, and I was offered the job of going down and being this guy's deputy in the Space Science Lab. Chuck was director of the lab. I thought that would be a dream job, and I took it, went down there, and we had a lot of fun until he up and retired on me. And and I could say it might not be as much fun. I didn't know, but we had a lot of fun stuff there. We could get off and talk a long time about all the different things we had going on in the lab there. A couple of hundred PhD scientists, I think, half were civil service and half were various universities, all working on all kinds of exciting satellites and sounding rocket experiments and so on. And it was just a neat place to be. But then I was there for about a year, and I was then offered the job of Deputy Director of Future Programs to further build on this stuff that I'd been doing. So I took that, and that began yet another phase of my career. Oh, I'm going to say that.
Well, we were very happy to have you back at the Space Sciences Lab, but realized that the new position on the planning was something that was badly needed. And wished you well as you went off.
You did, and besides that, you were leaving yourself. So, Chuck came out here to UAH and has done some wonderful things out here ever since, including he, together with Bob Middleton, spearheading what we're doing here today. So I went back up to program development and continued to sort of lobby for this space platform concept, while our friends were at Houston were lobbying for the big space station. Still no real progress being made, but in the meantime, something intriguing had been developing, and that was the possible commercial use of space. All kinds of ideas were starting to develop about, this gravity business we talked about earlier, for example. That may be some things we can do out there, or some things we can learn out there that might have real significance here on Earth. And John Deere was interested in metallurgy for their tractors. And they said, we don't understand what goes on. If we could go out in space, we think maybe we could understand it better, and then that would help us here on Earth know how to do a better job. So they actually flew some experiments to take advantage of that. The 3M company thought there were all kind of interesting processes. There were a number of companies that were wanting to try out some things. One of the most intriguing things that happened was Senator Heflin came up to our Space Sciences Lab one time on a visit, and we were telling him about some of these ideas of how in space perhaps we can do less. I mean, we can, without there being gravity, there's some unique things we can learn about crystals and so on that we can do otherwise. And he says, you know, this is very interesting. And just last week I was talking with a group down at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, in the medical area down there, that are trying to grow some kind of protein crystal, and they're having an awful time doing it. Maybe you guys ought to get together. So we called them up, and within a week, Charlie Bug came up with his crew, and we found out we had a match made in heaven. They were trying to grow these protein crystals because apparently, as they told us, and I hope I'm right in explaining it, the body has thousands, maybe millions of proteins in it that do all kinds of, control all kinds of things. Some cancers, to keep it simple, need a certain protein in order to thrive. And if they can isolate that protein, and as I understood it, if they could learn the structure, the physical structure of that protein,
where each atom is in the molecule.
Right. They could design a drug that would uniquely match up with that structure and put that drug into the body. It would match up, it would go around, it would find its match, and once it's locked up to that, then the idea was the protein would not be edible by the cancer, for example, and the cancer would starve to death. There were apparently 1,000 examples. This is just one that was easy for me to appreciate and understand. So they had to know the structure of the protein, and the way you get the structure is to grow a crystal of this protein and then put it in a crystallographer.
X-ray diffraction machine.
Thank you. Yeah, X-ray diffraction machine, and that would tell you the shape. But first you had to have a crystal. When they try to grow a crystal on Earth, all the little individual molecules in a crystal are lined up. If it's perfect, when they freeze, they line up like soldiers on parade. But on Earth, when they tried to do it, apparently the convection effects would disrupt this enough so that the soldiers didn't line up perfectly, and they couldn't get a perfect enough crystal to get it to use in this X-ray spectrometer to figure out the shape. Right. So they were desperate to grow near perfect crystals of proteins. So he says, maybe we can do it in space. So they said, let's try it. So within weeks, on the next shuttle flight, I think, we flew up some kind of a little simple test protein, and it worked. They grew the biggest, most perfect crystals they've ever grown, despite years of trying. So we knew we were probably on to something. And so they began to develop the more complicated proteins that were harder to do, experiments to try to grow them. And in fact, one of Dr. Bug's colleagues actually flew in space to try it himself, but they were hampered by the fact they were up there for such a short period of time, no more than just a few days. And that sort of thing led to this idea of maybe we need a space station. So this commercialization business began to pick up a lot of interest.
And I guess there was a high-level planning group put together to plan the future, and you were involved in that.
And that was the next step, yep. We had a new president, and that was Reagan. We had a new Vice President Bush, who was head of the Space Council. There was Reagan was ready to move the country forward again. We'd had some tough years prior to that. Inflation was high, unemployment was high. There was a level of morose, I guess. And so Reagan was looking for things that would get us looking out and looking up and getting excited. So I guess it was felt that maybe NASA had another opportunity, as we did early in the 60s. And so under Administrator Beggs, who was from Texas, by the way, and that's where there was a lot of interest in space stations, as I mentioned earlier, decided we ought to have a space commercialization task force. And he brought in a young lawyer named Bud Evans to head it up, and then they asked for representatives from the three manned centers, we call them, Kennedy, Houston, and Huntsville, and then headquarters. They ended up, there were 6 of us. I was a Huntsville representative. So I spent 6 months up there with these other guys looking at space commercialization and what initiatives maybe should there be on a national level. And before it was over with, we had developed 24 different initiatives that would be carried forward perhaps if the administrator wanted to, recommendations for things that might be done. And just for example, I think most people are familiar with land-grant colleges that have to look at agricultural things and that sort. Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but there were sea grant colleges also. So maybe it was time to think about space grant colleges. So one of the things I did was research these others and write up a proposal showing how that might work. And lo and behold, that was one of the ones that was accepted, and in fact, we now have space grant colleges, including UAH.
UAH. Many of the states have one.
And many others as well. Then another area was we needed to have centers of excellence in these individual areas of commercialization that would make sure that the focus was really being brought together in these different opportunity possibilities. And so centers of excellence were created at various places around the country, and that actually came to pass. And again, UAH was successful, and it was a very competitive process to be selected, but UH was selected, and guess who was in charge of it? The guy sitting here. So then we had other initiatives were to have some kind of a partnership arrangement where if an industry wanted to fly and experiment in space, then we would do it and work with them and maybe not charge them as much as we did, which we did do, a lot of commercial users, and yet they could still keep their patent rights to what they found out. And just a whole range of these initiatives that we offered and that did go forward. But the most important thing we probably did was we had contacts with the White House, Bud Evans in particular, and it was arranged at a luncheon in the White House for these industrial leaders, such as the president of John Deere and the president of 3M and others, who had been recruited, by the way, by the Marshall Space Flight Center. We arranged for them to have lunch with Reagan and to tell them why they were interested in this, to point out to him, and in the discussion, I'm sure it was a led discussion in a sense, to point out that one of the frustrations was the lack of time on orbit to properly do the work that needed to be done, and how a space station would surely be a nice thing. And so Reagan thought about it a while, and there was a State of the Union message coming up in January, and so our big desire was to get him to put that in the State of the Union as something that we would like to see him do. And so we had reason to believe that maybe he would make that as a major initiative from the executive branch. But we didn't know for sure whether he would or not. Our little team was put to work drafting up language for Reagan to use in his State of the Union, which I thought was rather audacious, me sitting there trying to put down. But we did. We cranked out different things, and all these inputs were provided and so on, and we still didn't know what was going to happen. And then finally the day came. It was January the 25th, 1984, the State of the Union. And at that time I was here in Huntsville. We had every reason to believe he might mention it. We had a bunch of folks who were really interested in that sort of thing. I said, let's have a party at my house and see what happens. So 50 folks from from the program development office came over to my house, and we sat around the TV to see if Reagan was going to say anything, and if so, what. And boy, did we hit the jackpot, because he talked about initially the fact that we had to get the national deficit under control. That was the number one thing we had to do. Great. Then he said, and I quote, "Our second great goal will be to go out and make commercial use of space," and all the things we wanted him to say. And you just couldn't do any better than that. And it was so exciting. And he told, afterward, he said, "Yep, we need to build that space station these guys wanted." And says, "You guys go out and see what you can do. I'll give you maybe $8 billion. Tell me, what can you do for $8 billion? And so we at Huntsville, together with the folks at Houston, they took the lead in it because it was more of a space operations center than it was a space platform. I hated to see that because I was a space platform guy, and I knew the scientists weren't that interested in this other thing, but nevertheless, it was still exciting. And they came forward with a concept and a model, and briefed him on it. He said, "Let's do it." And so that's the one that we're building today. So,
another thing that happened along in that same time frame was the establishment of a commercial office at NASA headquarters.
that's right. That was another one of these initiatives we recommended, was that the NASA headquarters should have a commercial office, which it did not have before, and that there should be offices at the various centers. And that all was put into place as well.
It was involved in all these other things you were talking about.
Right, yeah. So there was a lot came out of all of that. Yeah. It really was.
Jim Rose was for quite a while the associate administrator for the commercial program, a very active individual.
At NASA headquarters,
Right.
That's right. Uh-huh.
Well, so here we have the seeds for the space program, or for the space station.
Well, I think so. I think that a lot of people were trying to sell the executive branch on the need for a space station. I know in my heart that it was sold the day that the president of John Deere and the president of 3M and these other companies had lunch with President Reagan. That's when it was done. And that was it. As I said, we were there when Administrator Biggs was in the luncheon. He came back, briefed Bud Evans. Bud came running in to tell us. We were all waiting to see how the lunch went. And everybody was excited that Reagan really, really liked it. A little aside story that I heard later through the grapevine from being up there was that when Reagan sat down with, I guess, the members of his cabinet or some appropriate group to discuss whether or not this particular initiative is something that the executive branch should go forward with, Biggs or somebody made the case that it's something that needed to be done. But a lot of the others around the room probably saw it as competition and so on, and they were naysayers. Apparently everybody just about in the room was naysayers. When it all got done, the discussion, they turned to the president, and he says, "But you guys got to realize this is the sort of thing that great nations do, and I think we should do it."
So it was done.
It was done.
Well, another part of this whole effort was, how do you maintain man in space? And the whole biosphere issue came up. I think you had some interest in that.
Yeah, that was interesting. Most of that actually happened after I retired, even from NASA,
okay.
Because.
Well, when did you retire then?
Well, I retired at the end of 1993.
Okay.
But along in the late 90s and 80s there, we began to think about President Bush the first came on board, and he said we should not only build the station, but we should go ahead and plan on going back to the moon, this time to stay, and then on to Mars. Well, going to the moon for a camping trip of 3 or 4 days is one thing. Going to the moon to stay is a whole another matter. And you can't just take a little food supply with you in your backpack. You've got to plan on growing it. And the moon's not the most wonderful place for doing all of that. A biosphere is like a terrarium. It's self-contained, and so the idea was we needed to have something like that on the moon. And so different parts of NASA, not so much Marshall, but we're working on concepts for biospheres that where you grow your own food and so on. And that was about the time I retired. And as I started retiring, looking at other things to do, I got real involved with the emerging botanical garden in Huntsville. And the garden had the thought for a while, well, maybe we should do something that's unique. And what might that be? And one of the things we thought about, in addition to the traditional things, was to become a sort of a botanical garden center of excellence for biospherics of these kinds of things. And it would fit right in with what NASA was doing, and maybe there'd be funding possibilities, but it could be the place where we could explain the kind of biospheres. Maybe they would be building on the surface of the moon, and we could have one of our own of some sort. And that was a very popular idea at the moment. And a very unique thing happened, though. In Russia, the Soviet Union was beginning to come apart. And they had this guy named Gorbachev, who everybody knows about, who was more modern in his thinking, and he said we've got to have more interaction with the rest of the world. And in the middle of Siberia, a place called Krasnoyarsk, there was a center, and it was a secret city like Oak Ridge. Nobody much knew what went on there, and you weren't allowed to know. It was all very secret. And I'm not sure to this day, I don't know what they do there that made it so secret, but they were doing special things having to do with atomic bombs or something. And but there was a research group there who had apparently in the 60s, when we were trying to get to the moon, we didn't know, but we suspected the Russians were trying to beat us to the moon, and that turned out to be the case. They were. We beat them. We won the Cold War and that part of the Cold War. But this group in Siberia had been given the job to develop a biosphere to be used on the moon, or the concepts for it. And had done that in great secrecy and put a lot of really good work into it, but nobody knew about it because they weren't allowed to talk about it or to have any visitors or to go see anybody. And Gorbachev in mid-1995, 1989, told them, I think it's time you guys went out and met the rest of the world. And so they came to Huntsville and were meeting with some folks here at UEH, for example. And the UEH folks found out that these guys knew a lot about the biosphere and had done things and didn't know exactly what, but they knew our garden was talking about it, so they arranged to have a luncheon meeting between the two groups. And we were totally intimidated by these Russians, but we told about what our interest was and everything, and lo and behold, a month or two later, we got an invitation to come see what we've done in biospherics in Siberia at our expense. You get to Moscow, we'll take care of you. So a delegation from the garden of three of us, myself, I was president at the time, and then the director of the garden, and then my wife, who was the acting educational director. And we went over there with three folks from UAH who went over on other matters, and got there, and to our utter amazement, we discovered that these guys had built this biosphere back in the 60s. It was the size of a double-wide mobile home, and that they would lock 3 cosmonauts up inside of it, and they had just the right number of plants and the right varieties of plants, so that as the cosmonauts took in oxygen, breathed out carbon dioxide, the plants would take in the carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, and it would be balanced. The plants would also hydroponically grown, and so they found that you could just add the urine right into the liquid. The plants would absorb it, cleanse it up, would transpire from their leaves pure water, and the vapor from the water would collect on the cool stainless steel surface, would simply roll over into a little trough and be collected, and you could drink it. And so you had water, you had oxygen, and then you could eat the plants. And they had it all worked out. And they would lock these cosmonauts in there for 3 months at a time, and with nothing going in, nothing coming out, and claimed they could have stayed there indefinitely. We were allowed to tour this facility and take photographs and so on, and it was just an amazing thing. And they were excited to see us. A lot of them had been taking English lessons in hopes that someday they'd have a chance to use it with the rest of the world, since English was sort of becoming the world language. And for many of them, we were the first English-speaking people they'd ever seen, and so they were able to try their English out on us. We certainly didn't have any Russian we could try out on them. Each of the 30-something scientists that we met, they had a seminar in our honor, and each of them had been asked to come up with an idea of something we might do at the Botanical Garden, and to tell us about it using English if they possibly could. And that was just a neat thing. And at the end of our little seminar, the leader got up and said, "Today marks the end of our first day as a part of the international community." A very touching sort of situation, I think. And later on, UAH, Marshall, and this group from Siberia had a couple of international symposiums on biospherics, a couple, I believe, of which were right here in Huntsville. So that was an interesting little tie-in between NASA work and Botanical Garden in Huntsville.
Is that a scientific thread you think should be picked up again?
It will have to be if we're serious about going back to the moon, and this time to stay, or even on a extended to Mars, unless they come up with a better technique. It's going to be about a year to get there, won't it? And about a year to get back, and you'd probably like to be able to grow some fresh lettuce on the way, and maybe a few. We found out these tilapia fish were one of the most efficient ways of growing animal protein, for example, and chickens. Chickens are good.
Yeah.
And some kind of miniature goats are also real good. So we need to going to have to start looking into all that again.
Do we need to build a fire under the gardens to
I don't know.
Reopen that issue?
Well, the gardens, I'd led them down the path of getting involved in this, and then it all went away after Bush left office, and it may go away when this Bush leaves office, I don't know. But so we suddenly found ourselves building up an area of interest that wasn't there anymore, since we weren't going back to the moon this time to stay. The interest in biospheres kind of fell by the wayside. But maybe it'll all have to come back. We'll have to see how it does, whether this Bush leaving, whether or not it's sustained. And if it is, then it's got to be done. And I would like to see the garden again pick that up as a piece of what they do out there. It's been a wonderful career. Timing was just great, wasn't it, for all of us who were involved?
Are there any thoughts you'd like to leave for the coming generation that's planning to go back to the moon and do a lot of these things over again?
Well, I hope it works out for you. I think it's going to be it's going to be expensive, and we don't have the. Earlier, we had the Russians that we were competing with, and the feeling was we had to show our manhood, so to speak, and then show that capitalism was as good, if not better, than communism. And it was a lot on the line, I think, and we don't have that. It's going to be different this time, and so I worry about the sustainability of it, frankly. But I do hope that a way will be found to let us go back, and it will certainly be exciting, and it will certainly be challenging, and I hope that in the process all kinds of wonderful spin-offs can come out of it, as it did when we were doing the program. So we'll have to see how it all. It's a new day, and we'll have to see how it works out.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate your
thank you
giving us your thoughts on all these matters, and wish you well.
Thank you, Chuck. Appreciate it.